November 23, 1943, 03:45 hours. Fray F. Molesworth, England. The cold is a physical thing. It seeps through the fleece lining of Sergeant Frank Miller's A2 jacket, through his wool uniform, and settles deep in his bones. He sits on a munitions crate, the damp English air thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and wet earth. Around him, the hardstand is a city of giants, a sprawling metropolis of olive-drab aluminum. B-17G flying fortresses, dozens of them, sit motionless under the pale glow of shaded work lights, their noses painted with defiant girls and cartoon characters, their tails marked with the triangle A of the 303rd Bombardment Group, the Hells Angels Group. Frank pulls a worn, creased photograph from his breast pocket. It's his wife, Sarah, squinting in the bright Texas sun, a printed summer dress billowing around her. He can almost feel the warmth of that day, a world away from this bone-chilling pre-dawn ritual of preparation for death. He's 19 years old. His world has shrunk to the size of the Sperry Ball turret he will soon occupy, a terrifyingly exposed plexiglass sphere slung beneath the bomber's belly. It's the loneliest, most vulnerable position on the aircraft, a fragile bubble in a sky filled with cannon shells. The target for today's mission, Mission 82, is Berlin, the Big B. Just the name sends a cold dread through the veins of the most seasoned crews. It's a long flight, deep into the heart of the Reich where the Luftwaffe's wolves gather to feast. He looks up from the photograph at the sheer scale of the operation. Ground crews swarm over the bombers like ants, fueling, arming, checking engines. Trucks rumble past, their headlights cutting brief, ghostly tunnels through the fog. And it's not just this field. All across East Anglia, at dozens of air bases just like this one, thousands of other young men are doing the same thing. They are the tip of a spear of impossible length and weight. 2 years ago, this scene was unimaginable. 2 years ago, the very idea of darkening the skies over Germany with American-built heavy bombers was a fantasy, a politician's boast laughed at in the halls of the Reich Air Ministry. Hermann Göring himself had scoffed. He had called America a nation of cars and refrigerators, incapable of the will or the genius for total war. But Frank sees the proof that Göring was wrong. He sees it in the endless lines of brand-new bombers, planes that arrived just last week to replace the ones that didn't come back last Friday. They lose so many, yet every week more arrive, a relentless, unending river of steel and aluminum flowing across the Atlantic. Frank Miller doesn't know about grand strategy or industrial logistics. He doesn't know about the Willow Run factory or President Roosevelt's audacious promise. He only knows that for every friend he loses, another bomber seems to materialize on the flight line, ready to carry another crew into the fire. He folds the picture of Sarah, tucks it safely away and pulls on his gloves. The engines of the lead fortress cough to life with a gout of blue smoke and a deep guttural roar that vibrates in his chest. The sound is not just of an engine. It is the sound of a promise being kept. It is the sound of a continent-sized factory turning its gears. It is the sound that would ultimately silence the laughter of Hermann Göring forever. In the summer of 1940, the world held its breath. The Nazi war machine, a hurricane of steel and fire, had swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Poland had vanished in weeks. Denmark and Norway fell. The Low Countries were overrun. And then, the unthinkable. France, the great bastion of Allied strength on the continent, collapsed in a mere 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force was miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, but it left behind nearly all of its heavy equipment. Britain now stood alone, battered by the Luftwaffe in the Blitz, its survival hanging by a thread. Across the Atlantic, America watched in a state of anxious paralysis. The prevailing mood was one of staunch isolationism, a deep-seated desire to avoid another entanglement in Europe's bloody quarrels. The United States Army was ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's, equipped with leftover material from the First World War. Its air arm, the U.S. Army Air Corps, was a fledgling force with just over 2,000 aircraft, many of them obsolete trainers and biplanes. The American aviation industry was a collection of high-skill, low-volume workshops, producing beautifully crafted planes by the dozen, not by the thousand. In 1939, the entire industry produced fewer than 6,000 aircraft, a mix of civilian and military models. This was the strategic reality when, on May 16, 1940, as German panzers poured through the Ardennes, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered a message that stunned the world. He requested a massive supplemental defense appropriation, but it was not the billion-dollar figure that caused jaws to drop. It was a production target he laid out, a goal so audacious, so far beyond the realm of perceived possibility, that it was met with widespread disbelief. Roosevelt declared, "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." 50,000. The number was astronomical. It was more aircraft than existed in all the air forces of the world combined. To American industrialists, it seemed like sheer fantasy. To America's enemies, it was a joke. In Berlin, the Reichsmarshal and head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, a man of immense ego and a profound contempt for the United States, was reported to have laughed out loud. He famously remarked to his Luftwaffe generals, "The Americans are good about making fancy schemes and plans, but they are not organized to win a war. They make good refrigerators and razor blades." Göring's assessment was based on the Nazi worldview. They saw America as a soft, decadent, capitalist society, corrupted by consumerism and racial impurity, lacking the Spartan discipline and centralized state control that defined the Third Reich. German industry was geared for Blitzkriegshort, decisive wars won with technologically superior weapons produced in sufficient, but not overwhelming, numbers. The concept of a long, attritional war of production was alien to their strategic thinking. They believed the war would be over long before America's inefficient, chaotic democracy could ever mobilize its latent potential. They saw a nation of individuals. They failed to see the industrial giant sleeping beneath. The strategic plan was therefore laid. For the Axis, it was to win quickly. For Roosevelt, it was to transform the United States into what he would later call the great arsenal of democracy. He was not just requesting planes. He was fundamentally challenging the entire structure of the American economy, calling for a re-engineering of society on a scale unseen in human history. The battle lines were drawn not just on the fields of France or in the skies over Britain, but on the factory floors of Detroit, the drafting tables of Seattle, and the boardrooms of corporate America. The opening move in this industrial war was a number, 50,000. A number that was not a target, but a declaration of intent. The true soldier of this new kind of war wore overalls, not a uniform. Their battlefield was the assembly line, their weapon a riveting gun, and their enemy was time. Before Pearl Harbor, the call was a murmur. After December 7, 1941, it became a roar that echoed from coast to coast. The arsenal of democracy needed an army, and America answered. It was one of the greatest mass migrations in the nation's history. From the Dust Bowl farms of Oklahoma, the coal towns of Appalachia, and the quiet streets of Middle America, millions packed their lives into rusty cars and boarded crowded trains. They were drawn by patriotism and the promise of a steady paycheck to burgeoning industrial centers they'd only ever seen on a map. San Diego, Seattle, Wichita, and a place just outside Detroit that would soon become the most famous factory on Earth, the Willow Run. The perspective of this new soldier was one of dizzying change and relentless pressure. A farmer who had spent his life guiding a plow was now tasked with drilling precise holes into an aluminum wing spar. A housewife who had never worked outside. The home now stood for 10-hour shifts, her hands deftly wiring the complex nervous system of a B-24 Liberator's cockpit. This was the era of Rosie the Riveter, a symbol of the more than 6 million women who entered the workforce, shattering social norms and becoming indispensable to the war effort. They learned to read blueprints, operate massive hydraulic presses, and weld seams that had to withstand the stresses of 30,000 feet and 300 miles per hour. The fear and anticipation were different from that of a combat soldier, but no less real. The fear was of failure, a poorly driven rivet that could cause a wing to shear off in flight, a faulty wire that could silence a radio over enemy territory. The pressure was immense. Production schedules were not suggestions, they were military objectives. Banners hung from factory rafters proclaiming, "The guy in the fight depends on you, and every minute counts." Foremen stalked the lines, pushing for more speed, more efficiency, more planes. The work was deafening, grueling, and dangerous. The shriek of metal cutters, the percussive thunder of thousands of riveting guns, the roar of engines being tested. It was the symphony of industrial war. Workers fell from scaffolding, suffered injuries from heavy machinery, and breathed in toxic fumes. They worked in rotating shifts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. The sun became a novelty. Life was a cycle of work, sleep, and a few precious hours of leisure before it began again. Yet, there was an overwhelming sense of purpose. These workers knew they were not merely building machines. They were building vengeance for Pearl Harbor, lifelines for Britain and Russia, and the tools of liberation for Europe. When a completed bomber, gleaming and powerful, was towed out of the massive factory doors onto the tarmac, a wave of pride would ripple through the line. They would watch it take off, knowing a piece of them was flying with it. They were the anonymous ground crew for the entire Allied war effort, the foundation upon which air supremacy would be built. Their dog tags were their time cards, their foxholes the factory floor. They were the soldiers behind the soldiers, and their collective effort was about to create a miracle. In the opulent halls of Karen Hall, his lavish country estate, Hermann Göring surrounded himself with stolen art, sycophants, and an unshakable belief in the supremacy of the German martial spirit. His view of the coming industrial conflict was clouded by a fatal cocktail of arrogance, ideological blindness, and a profound misunderstanding of his primary adversary. The Nazi leadership's expectation of America was not just one of dismissal, it was one of contempt. Their ideology was built on the belief that strength came from racial purity, centralized authoritarian control, and a militarized society. America, in their eyes, was the antithesis of this. They saw it as a chaotic mongrel nation, a cacophony of competing interests where Jewish financiers, striking laborers, and profit-driven capitalists pulled the country in 1,000 different directions. How could such a system possibly unite to wage total war? Their intelligence reports, filtered through this ideological lens, confirmed their biases. They saw newsreels of American labor disputes, political infighting, and Hollywood frivolity, and concluded the nation lacked the requisite iron will. Göring's Luftwaffe was the embodiment of Nazi prestige and technological prowess. It was built for swift, decisive victory. Its aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, were superb fighting machines, designed and built by brilliant engineers. The German system excelled at producing high-quality, advanced weaponry in concentrated bursts. The entire German war economy, under planners like Fritz Todt and later Albert Speer, was structured for this kind of war. It was ruthlessly efficient in the short term but lacked the depth and resiliency for a protracted global conflict of attrition. They prepared for a sprint, not a marathon. When Roosevelt announced the 50,000 plane goal, German planners did their own calculations. They looked at America's 1940 output, its small number of specialized aircraft plants, and its consumer-based economy. Their conclusion was logical, based on their own model of production. It was impossible. To achieve such a figure would require a total economic transformation that they believed a democracy was incapable of enforcing. They expected America to, perhaps double or triple its output, producing a respectable number of aircraft, but nothing that could fundamentally alter the balance of power. They anticipated a few thousand American bombers might appear over Europe, to be dealt with by the Luftwaffe's elite and experienced fighter pilots, the Expert 10. Furthermore, the Nazis placed their faith in qualitative superiority over quantitative mass. They were developing advanced technologies, jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262, guided missiles, and advanced interceptors. Their expectation was that German ingenuity would always trump American brute force. They believed a handful of superior German pilots in superior German machines could hold off waves of mediocre pilots in mass-produced and therefore inferior American aircraft. This was their critical, fatal miscalculation. They saw the factory worker in Detroit as a soft, overpaid civilian, not as a soldier on a different front. They saw the Ford Motor Company as a maker of family sedans, not as a potential manufacturer of heavy bombers. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American capitalism. Its fierce competitiveness could be harnessed by national will. Its focus on consumer efficiency could be translated into military efficiency, and its sheer scale, once mobilized, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Göring and the Nazi elite looked at America and saw a flabby giant. They never imagined it could awaken with a sword in its hand. Their laughter in 1940 was the echo of a profound and ultimately self-destructive ignorance. The transformation did not happen overnight. It began with a series of frantic meetings, blueprints spread across massive tables, and seemingly impossible demands. The call went out from Washington. Convert. The Chrysler Corporation was tasked with building tanks. General Motors was handed contracts for everything from airplane engines to machine guns. But the most audacious challenge of all was given to the Ford Motor Company. Build the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber with over 1.2 million parts, designed by a competitor, Consolidated Aircraft. And build it not by hand, but on a moving assembly line. This was the industrial equivalent of the D-Day landings. It was a gamble of epic proportions. Henry Ford's engineers, led by the brilliant but notoriously abrasive Charles Sorensen, descended on the Consolidated plant in San Diego. They watched the slow craftsman-like process of building a B-24 and declared it obsolete. They would not build planes in a hangar. They would build a factory a mile long and a quarter-mile wide on a plot of Michigan farmland called Willow Run. The action was a symphony of construction and innovation. At Willow Run, the assembly line was a monster, an L-shaped behemoth stretching for more than a mile. Instead of a car chassis moving along the line, it was the massive fuselage of a bomber. Sub-assemblies, wings, tail sections, engine nacelles, were built on parallel lines and fed into the main line at the precise moment they were needed, a technique perfected in the auto industry. The factory had its own airfield, its own power plant, and housing for tens of thousands of workers. It was a city dedicated to a single purpose: building one B-24 Liberator per hour. The numbers tell the story of the offensive. In 1940, the U.S. produced just over 12,000 aircraft. In 1941, the number rose to over 19,000. After Pearl Harbor, the floodgates opened. In 1942, production skyrocketed to over 47,000 aircraft, nearly meeting Roosevelt's impossible goal in a single year. But this was only the beginning. In 1943, American factories churned out a staggering 85,000 planes, and in the peak year of 1944, they produced an almost unbelievable 96,318 aircraft. This was not just about bombers. At a plant in North American aviation, engineers performed a miracle by mating the superb airframe of their P-51 Mustang with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, creating the finest piston engine fighter of the war. Republic Aviation's factories pumped out the rugged, heavy-hitting P-47 Thunderbolt, beloved by pilots as the Jug. Grumman, on Long Island, became the Iron Works, producing thousands of tough F-6F Hellcat fighters that would sweep the skies of the Pacific. The manufacturing process itself was a battlefield of innovation. Alcoa developed new aluminum alloys that were stronger and lighter. Dow Chemical perfected the mass production of magnesium for incendiary bombs and lightweight engine parts. The electronics industry, still in its infancy, produced millions of vacuum tubes for radios, radar systems, and the top-secret Norden bomb sight. Every rivet driven, every wire connected. Every engine block cast was a shot fired at the axis. While the Luftwaffe was still relying on skilled artisans to build its advanced fighters in scattered, vulnerable workshops, America was applying the brutal, overwhelming logic of mass production. This wasn't just building planes. It was a logistical tidal wave. Raw materials flowed from mines and refineries, were processed in mills, and arrived by train at factories that ran non-stop, their lights blazing through the night. The finished aircraft were then flown by WASPs, women Air Force Service pilots, to depots and ports, beginning their journey to the battlefronts of Europe and the Pacific. The quiet hum of the pre-war workshops had been replaced by the deafening, earth-shaking roar of a nation at war. By mid-1943, the laughter in Berlin had died. It was replaced by confusion, then alarm, and finally a creeping sense of dread. The reports coming from Luftwaffe pilots on the Western Front were becoming increasingly grim and difficult to believe. The fancy schemes and plans of the Americans were no longer theoretical. They were a physical reality, arriving daily at 30,000 feet. The unexpected outcome was not merely that America met its production goals, but the sheer, crushing scale of the overachievement. The goal of 50,000 planes a year was not a ceiling. It was a baseline that was shattered time and again. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft. This number was so vast, so far beyond the Axis's wildest estimations, that it broke the calculus of the air war. The German Expert 10 could no longer rely on superior skill and tactics alone. A German ace might shoot down 2, 3, even 4 B-17s on a single sortie, a remarkable feat of airmanship, only to return to base and learn that the raid consisted of 700 bombers, and that another 700 would be coming tomorrow. The attrition math turned against them. The Luftwaffe could shoot down American planes, but they could not shoot down American factories. For every B-17 lost over Schweinfurt or Regensburg, 2 more were rolling off the line at Seattle or Willow Run. For every veteran American crew shot down, 5 more crews were finishing their training in the clear skies of Arizona and Texas. The technological gap also closed with terrifying speed. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 was a catastrophic shock to the Luftwaffe. Göring had famously boasted that if he ever saw American fighters over Berlin, the war was lost. In March 1944, he saw them. The P-51, mass-produced with American efficiency, could escort the heavy bombers all the way to their targets and back, meeting the Bf-109s and FW-190s on equal or even superior terms. The German fighters were now forced to fight their way through a swarm of American escort fighters just to get a shot at the bombers. The hunters had become the hunted over their own soil. The sight from the ground in cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin was apocalyptic. The 1,000-plane raid, once a theoretical concept, became a terrifyingly routine occurrence. The sky would literally darken with aircraft, the air filled with a continuous soul-shaking drone of thousands of engines that went on for hours. The relentless, systematic destruction of Germany's industrial heartland, its oil refineries, and its transportation networks was the direct, tangible result of this production miracle. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote after the war that the Allied air offensive was the single greatest factor in Germany's defeat. It was a war of production, and Germany was being buried under an avalanche of aluminum. The ultimate unexpected outcome was the inversion of the Nazi philosophy. The diverse, chaotic, individualistic society they had disdained had proven itself far more adaptable and resilient in a total war of production than their own rigid, centralized state. The American system, by empowering hundreds of competing companies and millions of individual workers with a common goal, had unleashed a torrent of innovation and output that no command economy could hope to match. The giant had not only awakened, it had revealed a strength that no one, not even the Americans themselves, knew it possessed. The psychological impact of America's industrial might was as devastating to the Axis as any single bomb. For the German fighter pilot, the change was profound and morale-shattering. In 1942, he was a knight of the sky, a celebrated hero defending the fatherland against small, manageable incursions. He flew a superior aircraft and possessed superior training and experience. The sky was his domain. By 1944, he was a hunted man. His world had become an unending nightmare of overwhelming odds. He would take off to intercept a bomber stream, only to find himself in a swirling three-dimensional melee against hundreds of enemy planes. The sheer number of targets was paralyzing. The sky was filled with contrails, tracers, and parachutes, too many of them German. His trusted wingman from yesterday was gone. The fresh-faced replacement who arrived this morning would be gone by evening. The fuel for his aircraft was rationed, the replacement parts were scarce, and the enemy was limitless. General Adolf Galland, the charismatic leader of Germany's fighter arm, famously articulated this despair. After encountering P-51s deep inside Germany, he told Göring, "I knew the war was lost." It was not a confession of military defeat in a single battle, but a recognition of a deeper, industrial truth. It was the moment he realized they were fighting not just an army, but a factory. The will to fight can be broken by more than just bullets. It can be crushed by the sheer soul-destroying weight of hopelessness. The sight of endless formations of American planes was a daily, visceral reminder that their cause was doomed. For the German civilian on the ground, the psychological effect was one of terror and abandonment. The constant drone of the air raid sirens, the nights spent in crowded shelters, the sight of their cities burning. It stripped away the Nazi myth of an impregnable fortress Europe. Göring had promised them that no enemy bomb would ever fall on a German city. Now the sky rained fire day and night. The relentless bombing eroded faith in the leadership and shattered the will of the populace to continue the struggle. Conversely, for the Allied forces, the effect was a massive surge in confidence. For the American ball turret gunner, crammed in his lonely sphere, the sight of hundreds of fellow B-17s stretching to the horizon, with dozens of little friends, the escorting P-51s, weaving protectively around them, was a profound comfort. It was a visual representation of strength, a feeling that he was part of something immense and powerful. Even with horrific casualty rates, the knowledge that the machine behind them was inexhaustible provided a crucial psychological backstop. For the ground troops preparing for the invasion of Normandy, air supremacy was the promise of a fighting chance. As they huddled in their landing craft on June 6, 1944, the sky above them was not filled with the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, but with the white stars of the Allied air forces. Thousands of fighters and bombers pounded the German defenses, isolating the battlefield and protecting the invasion fleet. This was the ultimate dividend of the production war, control of the sky, which made everything else possible. The roar of the engines that had started in Detroit and Seattle had become the sound of liberation for an entire continent. The unconditional surrender of the German High Command in May 1945 was signed with pens, but it was written in the skies over Europe. The industrial miracle that began with Roosevelt's audacious challenge was a decisive factor in the Allied victory. The ability to produce aircraft on such a colossal scale allowed the Allies to wage a two-front war, in Europe and the Pacific, simultaneously and successfully. Air supremacy crippled the German war economy, destroyed its fuel production, paralyzed its transportation system, and ultimately made the D-Day landings feasible. Without control of the air, the invasion of Fortress Europe would have been a bloodbath if not an impossibility. The cost, however, was immense. The arsenal of democracy produced the tools of war, but victory was purchased with the lives of its young men. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, suffered over 47,000 casualties, including more than 26,000 killed, more combat deaths than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in World War II. For every bomber that rolled off the assembly line, there was a story of a crew like Sergeant Frank Miller's, facing terrifying odds mission after mission. The sheer quantity of machines could not erase the quality of the human sacrifice required to fly them into combat. The broader impact of this monumental effort reshaped the world. The war mobilization permanently transformed the American economy and society. It pulled the nation out of the Great Depression, accelerated technological innovation, and triggered vast demographic shifts. The wartime partnership between government, industry, and science created a new entity, the military-industrial complex, a force that would dominate the nation's economy and politics for the remainder of the 20th century. Internationally, the war cemented America's position as the world's preeminent economic and military power. The nation that had entered the conflict with an army smaller than Portugal's emerged with a global network of bases, a nuclear monopoly, and an industrial capacity that dwarfed the rest of the world combined. The laughter of Hermann Göring in 1940 was a footnote to a story of epic miscalculation. He saw a nation of shopkeepers and dismissed them. He failed to understand that this nation of shopkeepers, when roused, could convert its entire civilization into a single, efficient, and unstoppable weapon of war. The legacy of the 50,000 plane promise is not just in the numbers. It is a testament to the latent power of a democratic society when unified by a common purpose. It is the story of how millions of ordinary people, engineers, welders, riveters, draftsmen, and pilots, achieved the extraordinary. They fought a war not only of courage and sacrifice but also of logistics, organization, and industrial will. And in doing so, they not only won the war but forged the American century in the fires of the factory floor.